I was certain I was not going to be alive in 2 or 3 more years. There was going to be a car bomb on the street as I was out. We were just certain we were dead men.
Conservative writer David Frum was once best known as the guy who wrote the famous George W. Bush phrase, "axis of evil," even though that's not exactly what he did write. But these days, the son of the Canadian broadcaster Barbara Frum is known as the guy who angered American Republicans by telling them that they blew the fight against Obama's health care program. We met David Frum in Washington, where he lives.
David, I wanted to start by asking you about your childhood, because as every Canadian knows, your mom was a very well-known
Yes.
and very forceful personality in Canadian journalism. What was it like growing up in that household?
It was definitely a high-pressure environment. And I think that was so for 2 reasons. First, there were 3 of us, my sister and much younger brother. My sister and I were very close. We always knew that my mother was a very remarkable person, and so we were always very concerned with her judgment. Also that of my father, who was and is a very remarkable person. So we had a household that was a very adult-centric household, and where my mother's thoughts, my father's thoughts and opinions mattered a great deal. Behind that was the fact of her illness, which we did not discover until we were in our adolescent years. But we were conscious of it, that she had a very sad view of life. And a lot of that sadness that we didn't understand as younger adolescents, but that we felt. She was diagnosed in 1974 when I was 14. I discovered the truth about the illness when I was about 17. And she then lived for almost 20 more years. That was something that we just felt. And she communicated a sense of the preciousness of everything, of the raspberry on your plate, of the view, of the sunset, of the dawn. Everybody says you should appreciate these things as if they were your last, but
yes.
In my mother's case, they really were. She always had that thought. She was 37 when she was told she had 2 years to live. She got 2 years to live 10 more times. But she was never told she had 20 years to live.
Yeah. So what does that do to you as a young man then? How does that affect your outlook on life? Does it mean you're a man who is not without a large degree of self-confidence? Is that from those years? Is that what you got out of that?
I think I did. I got it both from my mother and from my father, and from another remarkable person in my life, my mother's mother, Florence Rossberg, who died. She at a great age, almost 92. They were people who lived the life of the mind. They taught us how to read books. They taught my sister and me how to understand what is good and what is bad. And so that knowledge can destroy false confidence, but it also destroys false humility. I mean, it also means that you know if you're doing good work, you're able to know that you are indeed doing good work. We had a lot of intellectual disagreements when I was growing up. Some of them I was sometimes right about. I remember a very fierce argument in about 1977 or 78. I had just discovered the science of economics, and I was so excited about it. My mother was still kind of, in those days, holding on to the John Kenneth Galbraith's theory about big monopolies. And she said to me very scornfully, "It's just completely naive to think that a company like General Motors can go bankrupt." And I said, not only can it go bankrupt, it will go bankrupt, and we'll live to see it.
Now let me get this straight. You were 17 at the time.
Yeah.
Okay.
I said, well, this is the sort of the part of the story, and we'll live to see it. This was just before I knew she was sick.
Right,
but had
okay.
she had normal health,
Yes.
she would have lived to see it.
Yeah, amazing. I had read somewhere, or somebody told me somewhere, that at one point in your teenage years, you actually did some campaigning work for a New Democratic candidate. Is that true?
That's certainly true. In the provincial election of 1975, Janusz Stuxta was his name, and he's still a very active personality in Toronto. I don't think I was, especially at that point, I had a strong political sense or partisan sense, but I wanted to work on a campaign. I've always loved campaigns, and that was the first one I ever worked on. And although my mother was not a conservative, she also didn't like the left either. And so to equip me for this experience, I had to do a long journey. He was running in southwest Toronto, and we lived in the northeast, so it was a 45-minute ride on bus, subway, and trolley to the headquarters. She gave me, they just released in paperback, the English translation of the Gulag Archipelago. So that was my reading to and from.
And you're what age at this point?
I would have been 15.
15. And you're reading Solzhenitsyn.
Yeah, and that inoculated me against anything I was going to hear at local NDP headquarters.
Okay, all right. So your conservatism sprang from your years at university in the States? Where did it begin?
Well, I get asked this question a lot because people want to get a bead on my parents' thinking. And it took me a long time to come up with an answer, and I'm going to quote somebody. There's a fantastic biography of John Maynard Keynes by Robert Skidelsky, and he ends one of the volumes, I forget which one, by saying, it's a great mistake to think that people are only products of their backgrounds. They are also products of their times. Mm-hmm. So I grew up in those years of social disorder of the 1970s, in the years of the inflation. And a lot of the inflation informs, we were a business family, my father was interest rates and things like that were very important to him. We were formed by that experience of inflation. And then the disorder. And so there's nothing very remarkable about my political outlook, because when you talk to people who came of age between about 1978 and 1984, you'll see that we are much more likely to be market-oriented, much more likely to lean conservative than people who are older than us and younger than us. And that's true in whatever house you grew up.
Yeah, I think that's true. All right, let's talk about your years at the White House. As I mentioned to you before we started this, I read your last couple of books, and the George Bush book I quite liked. I think that your style of writing in it was very accessible. I think I'll confess I was surprised by this, that you're a pretty funny guy when you were writing. But you told stories in that book that I thought were quite revealing, not just about yourself, but about the whole experience of being in the White House. When you first arrived there as a speechwriter, you were essentially going in to write about economic matters. Is that right?
That's right. That was my brief. There was a recession on, and it turned out not to be as bad as people thought it was going to be. But there were a lot of reasons in 2000 and 2001 to fear that the country was heading into a recession, very like the one that happened after 2008. Many of the same problems: very high level of private sector debt, great oversupply in a lot of areas, that crisis was escaped for a lot of reasons, or at least it was cushioned for a lot of reasons. So that's what I went in to do. I had not been a big supporter of George Bush's during the campaign. I preferred John McCain during the nomination fight, and I had not been able to get a lot of enthusiasm during that election cycle. I'm a Republican and conservative. I supported him, but it was not one of the intense elections of my life. So I went in. I was persuaded to go in part to see politics from the other side. And that was an incredible learning experience. You learn just how amazingly difficult it is. And to gain, for someone who writes about politics, to gain more sympathy for what it's like to be not a politician on the campaign trail. I've been on lots of campaigns, but in office.
Yeah. You describe a White House that I thought was quite amazing. One which came with a seemingly strict set of behavioral rules and dress codes even, and it was an astonishingly strict place in that regard.
None of it ever communicated, but you knew. I mean, you knew that that a brown suit was too informal, that you were to come to work. And a lot of it was a reaction against the Clinton years, when in the early years people would come to work in shorts and flip-flops, at least on the weekend. A lot of it had to do with the strange personality of George Bush. This was a guy who had a lot of anarchic impulses in his personality, and they had been chained down one by one. And the story of his life was in many ways a story of just pure willpower suppressing a lot of chaos. Yeah. And that communicated itself to all the people around him, that they picked up on his demand for order and control. And it has good points. It had prices. I mean, it was not a very creative White House. It wasn't a very flexible White House. And one of the questions I asked in the book is, what if things went wrong? How would this White House respond? I was worried about that. And indeed, we saw in the second term when things went wrong that the White House was not able to respond very well. One more sentence on this. I think White Houses are doomed. I think they all fail, but because it's like designing one of those sailboats for the America's Cup race, that where you're told, there are like 5 dimensions that you want in your yacht, and they're all a trade-off, and more of this means less of that. So you can never have all you want in every direction. So you want to have a White House that is flexible and creative, but you also want it to keep secrets. You want it to have a lot of time for new ideas, but you also want it to be able to act quickly and decisively. And what you discover is those things trade off, and each White House overreacts to the one before, and then fails in a new way.
Yeah, and that would be true. I mean, I think that's true of pretty much all governments, and regardless of political stripe.
Yeah.
There's a built-in obsolescence to the idealism that each administration brings with it into office.
Well, let me put it this way: each White House is more like its predecessor and successor than its opponents or supporters would find comfortable. There are long continuities. Government works in the same way. And I think one of the benefits, one of the pieces of wisdom I think I got from that experience, and it's shaped a lot of my political thinking in the years since, and explains why I now find myself sometimes at odds with some of my conservative friends. You often had a sense there of terribly unfair criticism of the president you're working for. People criticizing him for not solving problems he can't possibly solve, like Obama and the oil spill. What precisely is it that he's supposed to do? Now, you can react to that unfairness by becoming very bitter about it, by saying, boy, I can hardly wait till the other guys are here, and then I can slam them in the same unfair way that they slammed us. I took from that experience feeling, I just don't want any part of this. I don't want ever to be implicated in doing something like that again. And the same standards of fairness that I would have wanted applied to my guy, long before I knew who the next guy was going to be, that was my resolution. I'm going to apply those standards to him or her.
Yeah. I want to ask you about, and I'll come back to that later because there's something I want to pursue along those lines. But I want to ask you about 9/11. You were at the White House that day. As you related in the book, and you relate quite powerfully. We'll talk a little. Tell me what your experience was that morning when it happened.
Okay, well, this can be a long story, so let me try to compress it into
Sure,
a short story.
sorry.
I was late for work that morning because I had to do drop-off duty with the kids. So I got to the White House. Late means about 8:30 in the morning.
Right.
The working day normally started between 7 and 7:30. The first plane hit at 8:46. So as I was actually arriving at my desk, my phone rang, and my wife was telling me what had happened. And then I just, I pretty quickly figured out this was something very, very serious. And my wife said, you need to come home quickly. Things are very uncertain. And I said, I'm very adamant. No, I'm staying here. And after that sort of moment of bravado, we were all then forcibly evacuated by the Secret Service.
As you say in the book, you wanted to do something. And
what do you
do?
A
speechwriter. You're going to type with zeal.
Exactly.
Patriotism.
We were all evacuated into Lafayette Square, actually a block north of Lafayette Square. And it was just a scene of total chaos, because it turned out the White House disaster plan had been written during the Cold War. And it was written in anticipation of a nuclear decapitation strike. And so the plan was you get the president up in the air in Air Force One, you get anybody whom you can't get up in the air into the bunker deep underneath the White House where there's room for about 12 or 15 people.
And everybody else is toast.
And everybody else is dead, which is very sad for them, but
Yes.
you don't have to worry about where to put them. But no one, and then no one ever returned to this after the end of the Cold War. And no one had ever anticipated a contingency where the White House was shut down, but everybody who worked in it was alive and unharmed. And so we all milled around all that for much of that morning. Many people went home. I went to the American Enterprise Institute to borrow the phone and to watch TV. It's around the corner. And then I got a message a little later that they, in fact, had a working space for us in downtown Washington. So I got there about noon. Now, it's very important to the story to understand that the West Wing is completely wrong. The White House is physically shabby. Everything except the area the president that immediately works in. It's much more physically shabby than people understand, and much more technologically backward. We didn't have, in 2001, every corporation in America has a flat screen. We still had the big, bulky ones. But we're called to this location, and it was so sleek. I mean, beautiful computers, beautiful phones, and a wonderful lunch that had been laid out. We were all starving, and not the usual White House hot dogs and hamburgers and potato chips, portobello mushrooms on grilled focaccia, that kind of, yuppie America. I said, this is amazing. This is just what I always expected, the government's secret location. And it was explained to me, no, this is the government relations office of Daimler Chrysler. They lent it to us, and that was the lunch they were going to be eating for themselves. So I was there for most of the afternoon, and it was there that I got the word that my dear friend Barbara Olson was one of those who had been killed. She was on the flight from Washington to Los Angeles. And it was like a war zone. I mean, you came out of there, downtown was taped off. And this is the thing that I think that people need to bear in mind now. Everybody was certain there was more to come. Mm-hmm. And when the anthrax happened, everybody was certain that this was a portent of what was to come. And it sounds kind of overdramatic to say it now. I was certain I was not going to be alive in 2 or 3 more years. There was going to be a car bomb on the street as I was out. We were just certain we were dead men.
Yeah.
And that, I think, framed a lot of what came out of that admission. And I think everybody shared that feeling. That we were dead men. We were on borrowed time.
You write in the book, too, and I thought this was interesting. My sense was that there was, because of that act and because of what happened here in Washington, the plane that hit the Pentagon, what could have been the plane that hit the White House where you were, the one that went down in Pennsylvania, you had this welling of patriotism for this country. You write in the book that this was, suddenly you thought, this is my city, Washington, the city we're sitting in now. This is my city. This is my war.
Yeah.
Did you become an American at that moment?
I put in the papers, but actually in the classic demonstration of what happens with American bureaucracy, they were promptly lost.
Yeah. So it was like 5 years later or something,
yes,
right?
I was naturalized till 2007. But there has been a disconnect in some ways in the feelings about this war between Washington and the rest of the country. I often travel around and I'll hear people say, well, this war is happening on television. It's very abstract. And well, gee, I know 24 young people who have borne arms in Iraq or Afghanistan, for children of my friends, people, some of the interns at the White House. And I've known hundreds of people who have passed through Iraq and Afghanistan in civilian capacities. And I've been to both places. I mean, here it feels very personal. And that may be kind of a disconnect, and that may have been a part of the disconnect that happened between the Bush administration and the country, is it remained a very real and intense thing. Seasoned, I think, a little bit by the shame we felt for what had happened on 9/11. I mean, that it could have been prevented. The Bush administration, I think everyone knew that. And although you would deny it passionately, that knowledge preyed on you, that had things been done a little differently, it could have been prevented. And then there was the shame of the evacuation. I think I quote in the book, I quip in the book, that one of the T-shirts that became very popular to see was after 9/11 was picture of the American flag on the T-shirt with the phrase, "These colors don't run." But of course, we all did.
Mm-hmm. I have to ask you about the Axis of Evil speech, though I don't want to get into why you wrote it or anything. What I'd like you to talk about is the fallout from it. First of all, I guess it came as a surprise to you that it was retained, and it actually wasn't what you wrote, was it? You wrote Axis of Hatred, I believe.
Yes. Well, the whole thing about these, the thing that people need to understand is that writing a speech for the president is a combination of writing a lawyer's brief and writing for the movies. It's like a lawyer's brief in that when your client wants to sue somebody and he retains you to help him do it, your job is to do it for him as effective. I mean, you're not there. He's not asking you your advice, especially unless you're like a senior partner. But your job is to make the best case that you can for your client. So in that sense, you're an advocate. But the second way it's like writing for the movie it's writing for the movies because you have a character. And you're a writer. You don't write what you would say. You write what the character would say. You have to be true to the character. And those two facts about writing ran through all of my experience there. It's one of the reasons, by the way, that so many of the best books about the White House are written by speechwriters. Not that they're so important, but they have to get into the mind of the president in a way that other people don't. So, William Safire, Peggy Noonan for Ronald Reagan, Robert Sherwood for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. These are the outstanding White House memoirs, and they're all speechwriters, and none of them were intimates of the president, except psychically and internally. Yes. They became intimates because they had to anticipate what he would say. So you begin, especially for State of the Union, then you begin by writing acres and acres of paper, possibilities, suggestions. People say, well, what if we said this? What if we say that? And you try it out. And you put together your pieces. So I'd written a dozen different sections for the speech. Some of them farms. That ended up on the cutting room. Space, out that goes. But I wrote a section about, well, what if the president wants to go to war with Iraq? How would he argue this case? Or at that point, we didn't know whether it was Iraq or Iran. I mean, with this hypothetical Middle Eastern country that could be either Iraq or Iran. And so I wrote a passage that became then the basis of that key paragraph in that speech. And then you put it into the machine, and you don't quite know until the very end whether the president will say it. And even when you get the final draft, you still don't know whether he will say it, because with these speeches that are so important, even George Bush, who liked to close things up early, he would be tinkering till the last minute, and things would be added, things would be dropped. So until you watch it on television, you don't know for sure. I'm told that the man who wrote the speech in which Franklin Delano Roosevelt first used the phrase New Deal had no idea that the New Deal would catch on. I had when this thing came out and it was a coordinated product, and we started with my axis of hatred and it became axis of evil. I knew that if the president said it, and I wasn't sure he would, this would be a defining threat. Yeah, this was a hook.
It was a hook. So you write in the book that on your last day at the White House, when you were standing there as a woman who walked in, and you said, "Oh, you're having your moment."
Yes.
But you write, the moment you were having wasn't, "I'm looking at the White House from the inside for the last time." The moment you were having was, "Do I sue Robert Novak?" Because the story then got out that you had told someone that you were responsible for that section of the speech, and then he reported that you'd been sacked because of it, which wasn't true.
Yes. Well, actually, I now, at this point in my career, I have that whole episode has an even more ironic twinge, because twice in my Washington career, twice in 10 years, I've been in the center of a media storm over a departure from a job.
That's right.
And in 2002, the departure was I was leaving voluntarily, and a lot of people in my immediate vicinity wanted to persuade people that I had been fired. And then in 2010, I was fired, and a lot of people in my immediate vicinity were trying to persuade the press, no, I'd left voluntarily. So it was kind of a strange bookend experience. In that case, it was just Robert Novak, late journalist, very effective journalist, but one of his rules was he had no friends and no enemies. He knew two kinds of people: sources and targets. And I was one of the few people in the Bush administration foolish enough to have taken literally the injunction, "Don't talk to journalists." So although I'd had a pre-existing social relationship with Novak and went to lunch with him, splitting the bill, I wouldn't talk to him, and that made me a target. And so on departure day, that he exacted his punishment. He went on CNN at 5 o'clock, and just as I'm packing up my box, he goes and says he's heard this rumor, and he, caveated it in such a way that no one could say he was a liar, but he had heard this. This is as I was packing up my stuff, and I think the joke I tell in the book about it was I went to the press office to complain and said, "You people have to put out a statement. This makes me look really bad." And Ari Fleischer had already left, but his deputy that day said, "Well, actually, you don't understand. It makes the president look bad because it makes the president look petty." And she said, "You're not even out of the building, and you're already thinking like a civilian." Thinking about you, not the president.
In our last couple of minutes, I want to ask you about, because you made a reference to a couple times now to this, your latest firing from the American Enterprise Institute, and because of the remarks that you made about how the Republicans dealt with the health care issue, which I guess shouldn't have come as too much of a surprise to anybody, because in your book, Comeback, basically you said more or less the same things about them. Nonetheless, there you go. But I wanted to ask you what you think as... You still have Canadian citizenship, I'm assuming, as well as American, so you have sort of dual...
I'm building a little house right now in Prince Edward County. So
there you go. Okay. So I want to ask you what your feeling is, because I know that myself and a lot of my friends had these, were appalled at the level of vehemence in the debate. It wasn't even a debate, the screaming matches over the healthcare issue in this country, in the United States, while it was going on. It reached the point where some of us thought, this is going to end up in in a killing. Somebody will be assassinated. Yes. I mean, it was incredible. Did you find it that way as well? It was
very inflated. It was inflated beyond the facts of the situation. It was inflated far beyond people's actual true positions. And maybe coming from outside, it's sort of hard to see what was going on. But there are a number of drivers here. I mean, the first is the extraordinary economic distress in the United States since the summer and fall of 2008. It's much worse than in Canada. And it doesn't just affect the unemployed. Even people who have kept work, their houses are worth less. If their stocks and bonds are worth much less. If the Americans feel under pressure and threat in a way that probably they haven't since the middle 1970s. So that's one thing that is inflaming this. The second is Republicans, I think, do carry the sense this crisis happened on their watch, and although that's not something, again, that you think aloud to yourself, it's something that you feel. And there's a combination of guilt, but also a combination and also desire to fix the blame on somebody else. So a lot of the debate is really a debate about who did this to us. It was you. No, it was you. And the passionate intensity that comes from that. It's also true that the months since President Obama's election have been very plastic, shapeable moments. The United States really could take a very different path from the path it's been on in the past quarter century. So there's a lot at stake, and temperatures ran really high. I thought basically a lot of people in my party had lost their mind because first, getting healthcare costs under control is absolutely essential to the future economic success of the United States. Americans spend 60% more than anybody else for healthcare. They don't get any better results for it or anything you can measure. Just to put it in this context, if Americans spent per person the same amount as the runner-up country, Switzerland, does, that would be the equivalent of getting the entire United States defense budget for free. You pick up 4.5 points of GDP, bang. So it's a pressing problem, and it also impedes a lot of things that Republicans want to do. I mean, it's hard to imagine, as these costs are growing very rapidly, how you'll ever have tax cuts again, how you will sustain a military budget. So there were points of commonality here. And you also had to know, if you're a Republican, Democrats knew they must do this. They had seen this movie before. If a Democratic president comes into office with these big majorities and he cannot deliver on this fundamental Democratic priority, something that has been a promise for a quarter century, if he fails, they're just all going to be fired.
Pack your tents and leave.
Yeah, you guys are useless. You can't play this game. Let's start a new political party. It was suicide for them not to do it. Therefore, they would do it because they had the votes to do it.
Last question then. Will these people forgive you? Or are you persona non grata amongst a big element of the GOP now for the rest of time?
Well, there was an old rule in common law that, in the law of libel, that truth is not a defense against libel, truth compounds libel. So I think the fact that if I end up looking right, I think that will, in some people's eyes, make my offenses worse. But I think life is not long, as my mother would say, but it's longer than you might think when you were 21. There are a lot of turnings. And on this one, I see my job is to maintain, I'm going to borrow a phrase of a great mentor of mine, Bill Buckley's, when he was asked in 1970 what he was doing. My job is to maintain a landing strip in the jungle for a republicanism that is culturally modern, that's interested in governance, that wants to be economically inclusive, that is not just for the interests of the people at the top. And the party will have to go in that direction. And when it does, the planes are welcome to land, coffee and Coke is on the house, and I won't ask anybody to say thank you.
David, thanks for doing this. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.